Welcome to our next video, which explores how the Old Testament story raised questions that are ultimately answered in the person and work of Jesus. We'll highlight those questions, especially about the wounded victor, the messianic king in David's line, and the prophet greater than Moses. This is part of our Bible reading plan with Anthem Church, and today's video comes from a discussion I led a few years ago, and I edited it to give you the essential background so that you better understand the significance of the stories about the life and ministry of Jesus in the Gospels. So let's get started. What I want to focus on now is really looking at the literary background and kind of the story that we've been reading to this point. What questions were created, and then how is Jesus answering those questions? And so in the biblical story, God becoming man as Jesus to fulfill God's promises to humanity, that is the turning point in the biblical story. It's moving the story in a new, different, and unexpected direction. And you think about all the incredible stories we've read to this point, seeing God work through his people, Abraham and Joseph and Moses and Ruth and David, Esther, Haggai, and many others, the reader is still left with a lot of questions, which we identified through our reading to this point. You can see them listed on the screen. Now, as we come to the New Testament, the unanswered questions of the Old Testament are answered in the person and work of Jesus as revealed in the Gospels and New Testament letters. Now, you might be wondering how so. That's what we're going to be talking about now. Jesus is the wounded victor who conquered evil and death by resurrecting to new life, and thus initiating the new covenant by his sacrifice on the cross. Now, second, Jesus is the messianic king. He is the one that is in the line of David, who will bless the world as promised to Abraham by inviting all people to live under his reign and to follow him. Now, third, Jesus is also the greater Moses. He's forming a new people of transformed hearts who base their lives upon his upside-down teachings to lead by serving, to love one's enemy, and to welcome the poor, the broken, and the social outcasts into the family of God. Now, before his arrival, there will be a prophet like Elijah that we read about in Malachi, who will prepare the way for Jesus. And so his name is John the Baptist. And he's the final Old Testament prophet. And we'll get into that in a little bit as well. So before we look into the Gospel of Luke, let's begin by transitioning with the biblical story to understand how significant it is to see Jesus as the fulfillment of the wounded victor, the prophet greater than Moses, and the messianic king from the line of David. So hang with me, just giving this kind of context as we enter into the New Testament together. So let's look back before we look forward, starting with the wounded victor. Here's the verse that references this back in Genesis 3. Now, it's pretty incredible when you look back to the beginning of the biblical story in Genesis 3:15. This is a remarkable verse. Satan had just deceived humanity to reject God, resulting in sin, condemnation, and death in our world. Yet, immediately following humanity's failure, God promised to raise up one human being to rule over and defeat the work of Satan. And this is the wounded victor who would one day crush the serpent or Satan, and at the same time would be wounded in the process. Now, this passage clearly points to the promise of Jesus' birth and victory over Satan at the cross as described in the Gospels. First, we see the woman's offspring foretold in Genesis 3:15. That's Jesus. He's virgin born, so literally the offspring of a woman. You can read about that more in Matthew 1:25. Second, as Jesus steps into his God-given mission, we saw that Satan simultaneously enters the story. He wasn't mentioned much in the Old Testament other than in Genesis that we read in the beginning, and then in Job. He's in the backdrop of the Old Testament. So now he comes visibly on the scene in the Gospels, entering the story to unsuccessfully tempt Jesus into sin, revealing how a larger spiritual battle has begun. And so you see throughout Jesus' life, he faced off against countless demons who were the offspring of the serpent, who are conspiring to oppose the work of Jesus, culminating with his death on the cross. And yet, the serpent's strike on the cross did not spell the end for the offspring of the woman. Jesus rose on the third day, breaking the power of death and winning the ultimate victory. With the cross, Jesus crushed the devil's head, defeating him forever. And so in Genesis 3:15, we have a picture of Jesus' triumph over sin and Satan at the cross. Jesus is the wounded victor we've been waiting for since the beginning of the biblical story. So next is the prophet like Moses that you see here in Deuteronomy 18:15. Moses was one of the greatest heroes of the Jewish people. He wrote much of the Old Testament when you think of the Torah, and he was the one who delivered them from evil and oppression and gave them an identity as God's special people. He was the one who was the author that God used to write the Torah. Now, Moses' reputation was so big that he became like a symbol for the Jews, representing what was good and right as revealed to them in the Torah, which God had given to them through Moses. So as Moses told the world to expect the coming of a prophet greater than him, this created a lot of expectation for God's people. And you see that here in Deuteronomy 18:15, a prophet like me God will raise up for you among the people. He is the one to whom you shall listen. So as a result, much of the gospel accounts were crafted with this expectation in mind. You can see it most clearly in the Gospel of Matthew that really emphasizes Jesus as the greater Moses. You see a key story in the gospel accounts of Jesus' transfiguration when he both revealed his divinity to the disciples. We read that earlier this week. And at the same time, when he's transfigured, who appears? Moses and Elijah. Moses appeared to confirm Jesus' identification as the prophet Moses had declared was coming, and to tell them that they need to listen to Jesus, that his disciples need to listen to him. So as significant as Moses was for God's people, Jesus is and was worthy of greater honor than Moses because Jesus was God's beloved son. He had the power to deliver humanity from the source of evil, not just evil and oppression, but the source. And then Moses himself testified that Jesus is the one they've been waiting for and who they needed to follow because Jesus had the power to fulfill the law. Now, as we are going to get into the New Testament letters, Paul gives perspective to this reality that I wanted to highlight just briefly. He compared Jesus' more desirable new covenant with the less desirable old covenant ministry of Moses. The blessing of the Mosaic covenant was less desirable because it was conditioned on humanity's obedience to the law. That's why it made him lesser than. It was impossible to fulfill the law due to the heart condition of humanity that keeps breaking the law because our heart is not right with God. The Mosaic law did more to reveal humanity's sin and failure than to provide a solution for humanity. And that's where Jesus in the new covenant, he provided God's solution. And therefore, it's more desirable as an unconditional covenant based entirely on the promise fulfilled in Jesus, who by his death and resurrection offered forgiveness to restore fellowship with God and to give humanity a new heart so that they can live out God's law and reveal God's character to the world. So that's why this is so significant. The New Testament writers were making a big statement by showing and explaining to the reader how Jesus is the prophet greater than Moses. He's the one that we've been waiting for. So he's the wounded victor, he's a prophet greater than Moses, and he's the Messianic king. And so this is the last one I want to highlight before we get into the New Testament discussion. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So just kind of hang with me here for a second. This last one here, Jesus is fulfilling this promise given in 2 Samuel 7:16. So similar to Moses, you see a huge emphasis in the New Testament on Jesus as the Messianic king in the line of David. And so in the same way that Moses was this larger than life figure for the Jews, it's similar with David. You see him emphasized in the New Testament considerable amount. David was one of the great heroes of the Jewish people. He overcame their enemies, united their kingdom. He provided them with hope of a future Messianic king who would establish their kingdom forever. The word Messiah comes from a Hebrew word meaning anointed one or chosen one. So that word embodies the Jewish hope of a coming deliverer in the line of David, who's predicted in the Old Testament prophecy here of 2 Samuel 7:16. They're going to set up an eternal kingdom and rule on earth without end. And as a result, much of the gospel accounts were crafted to show how Jesus fulfilled this messianic expectation. In fact, Jesus is introduced as the promised Messiah at the very beginning of Matthew in chapter 1:16, in Mark in chapter 1:1, in Luke 1:32 and 69, and then John in chapter 1:20 and 30. So this is a big emphasis as we transition from the old to the new. And in fact, every time someone says Jesus Christ, Christ is not his last name. The word Christ is referring to the Messiah. It means Messiah or anointed one. So it's literally saying Jesus the Messiah. Now, there's several things that the Jews expected the Messiah based on the Old Testament prophecies. Those are highlighted here on the screen. The Messiah would be a Hebrew man. See that in Isaiah 9. Born in Bethlehem in Micah 5. Of a virgin, Isaiah chapter 7. He's a prophet akin to Moses that we looked at in Deuteronomy 18. A priest in the order of Melchizedek, Psalm 110 gets into that. He's a king, Isaiah 11. And then the son of David. You see that in Matthew, but you also see in Isaiah, it talks about how he's going to suffer before entering his glory. The key here is that Jesus met each of these messianic requirements. Each of these Jesus fulfilled. And so as the Messiah, this meant that Jesus came to set all things right and to rule in righteousness and peace. Now, what is significant to understand is that Jesus' first coming that we read about in the Gospels, that was the inauguration of his reign. So you think about a president has his inauguration, it was kind of the beginning. It was to really set a vision for who Jesus is and what he has accomplished. And so Jesus came to begin his reign in the lives of his believers who trust in him, and so that the world can experience his kingdom on earth through his followers who live out his kingdom values as empowered by the Holy Spirit. The issue here, though, is that his kingdom reign, the consummation, will not fully occur until his second coming in the future, when he will do what no king, no ruler, no government has been able to do, by bringing peace on earth as prophesied in Isaiah 9:6 and affirmed in Luke 2:14. And so until that day, his people live in the world, God's people live in the world we're inviting them to join us. As followers of Jesus' kingdom values, we want to be the blessing that was promised to Abraham, that we're inviting the world to join us in this effort to live under Jesus' reign, his goodness, and his righteousness in our lives. And so that's something where he's reigning in our hearts, and we're living that out as we follow Jesus in our day-to-day lives. And so all said, Jesus fulfilled all of God's promises to humanity. He is the wounded victor. He is the prophet greater than Moses, and he's a promised messianic king in the line of David. So he answers our unanswered questions of the Old Testament. Jesus is the turning point in the Bible and in our lives.